First time something went missing. Well, I didn't even notice. My phone charger, just one of those cheap, generic ones that I bought in a rush from a convenience store, just wasn't on my nightstand one morning. I was annoyed, but thought little of it. It probably fell behind the bed. Or maybe I took it somewhere and forgot. It happens, right? I am not the most organized person in the world, so a small misplaced charger was not going to keep me up at night. Days passed, then something else disappeared. This time, it was a half-full bag of coffee beans. Now, that was weird. I'm a huge fan of coffee, and I keep a steady stash in my cupboard because, quite frankly, coffee is life. The bag was there the night before. I remember making a pot of coffee around midnight while binge watching a true crime documentary. But in the morning, it was just gone. I was mildly irritated, but chalked it up to memory lapse. Maybe I absent-mindedly threw it away. I decided to move on with my day, telling myself I'd just buy a new bag. Only, it kept happening, small things here and there. The box of tissues I kept on the coffee table was nowhere to be found. My keys would shift positions. I always hung them on the hook by the door, but I'd find them tossed on the couch, in the kitchen sink, even under my bed once. That one really freaked me out. I'd been living alone in this apartment for over a year. I knew my routines, my habits. This wasn't just clumsiness or forgetfulness. The real turning point came one rainy night. I was curled up on my couch, wrapped in a blanket, watching a late-night horror movie. The wind was howling outside, rain tapping against the windows, and I was feeling that perfect, cozy creepiness only a good scary movie could bring. Then I heard a soft thud from my bedroom. I froze. My heart started to pound. At first, I told myself it was nothing. An old apartment like mine makes all kinds of strange noises when the temperature changes, when the wind blows too hard, when the pipes groan with hot water. But this noise, this was deliberate. It sounded like someone had gently closed a door or dropped something soft onto the carpet. I got up, trying to ignore the tightness in my chest, and slowly walked toward my bedroom. The hall light flickered slightly, casting strange, elongated shadows on the walls. I reached my bedroom door, pushed it open, and looked around. Nothing. Everything looked normal, just as I'd left it. My bed was unmade, the way I usually left it in the morning, and my clothes from work were still lying on the floor. But something felt off, a kind of wrongness that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I searched the room, checking under the bed, in the closet, even behind the curtains. Nothing. I let out a shaky breath and returned to the living room, laughing at myself a little for being so paranoid. Get a grip, I muttered under my breath, settling back into my spot on the couch. Then my phone lit up on the table beside me. A message from myself. Did you hear that, too? My breath caught in my throat. It was like the world had tilted off its axis. My fingers hovered over the screen, trembling. This was impossible. I didn't send that message. And the message itself, it was so specific, almost mocking me. Like someone knew I'd heard the noise and was taunting me. I must have stared at the message for a solid minute, heart hammering in my chest. My hands shook as I tapped on the message thread, trying to see if it was some kind of glitch, a prank from a friend, or maybe an app malfunction. But no, the message was right there, clear as day, with my own contact name at the top. Panic started creeping in, clawing up my throat. I forced myself to delete the message, locking my phone and setting it face down on the table as if that could somehow erase what had just happened. I tried to shake it off, told myself I was being irrational, that I was letting my imagination run wild. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. In the days that followed, the disappearances got worse. Not just little things now, but more personal items. My favorite sweater, a photo of me and my dad, my spare set of house keys. Each day, I would find myself looking for something I knew I had, only to discover it missing. And always, there was that feeling of being watched, of someone hovering just outside my line of sight. The final straw came about a week later. I'd been out with friends and came back home late, a little tipsy and exhausted. I stumbled into my apartment, tossed my keys on the counter, and headed for the bathroom to splash some water on my face. As I looked up, catching my reflection in the mirror, my blood ran cold. There was a message written in red lipstick across the bathroom mirror. "I like your apartment. I think I'll stay." I stumbled back, crashing into the wall behind me, my eyes wide with horror. My mind raced, trying to piece together an explanation that didn't involve someone breaking into my home and leaving ominous messages, but there was no other explanation. My breath came in shallow, panic gasps as I ran through the apartment, throwing open every door, checking every closet, even looking behind the shower curtain like I was in some cheap horror movie. But there was no one there. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every groan of the apartment sent me into a panic. I lay awake, clutching a kitchen knife under the covers, too terrified to close my eyes. Then, a few nights later, I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with the undeniable feeling that I wasn't alone. My skin prickled as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, straining to hear anything, any movement. And then, I did hear it, a soft, rhythmic breathing coming from the foot of my bed. I froze, terror like ice in my veins. I didn't dare move. My mind raced through all the possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Slowly, ever so slowly, I inched my hand toward my phone on the nightstand. I kept my eyes on the ceiling, trying not to let my movement betray me, praying that whatever was in the room wouldn't notice. Just as my fingers touched the phone, I heard it, a low, raspy whisper, "Don't go, I'm still here." I screamed, bolting upright and switching on the lamp, but there was nothing there. No one at the foot of my bed, no signs of anyone else in the room. But the feeling lingered, that sense of eyes boring into me, that someone or something was lurking in the shadows, just out of sight. I didn't stay in that apartment much longer. I packed my things and moved out as soon as I could, leaving behind anything that reminded me of that place, that feeling of dread that had seeped into every corner of my life. Even now, months later, I sometimes feel it, the prickling sense of being watched, the faintest hint of a shadow moving at the edge of my vision. They say that in cases like mine, the perpetrator is often someone close to the victim, someone they trust. But I never found out who it was, or what it was. And some nights, I still wonder if, even though I left, maybe it hasn't, maybe it followed me here. The day the last train arrived, everything changed. The first thing people noticed was the smell, a thick, humid stink that rolled up the stairwells from deep below the city streets. The station had flooded, that much was clear. There had been heavy rains, rumors of a burst sewer line or a busted pipe. Just another inconvenience in a place already filled with constant noise and grimy walls. No one thought much of it. Everyone just wanted to get on with their day, shove into the usual overcrowded trains, press their backs against those stained plastic seats, and close their eyes to ignore the person wheezing in their ear. Life in the city didn't have room for delays. And, like clockwork, when the water started pooling, the crowds piled onto the platforms, waiting, impatient. It was strange, really, that no one noticed it sooner. Looking back, it feels obvious, like it should have been the kind of warning that makes your hair stand on end, a sense of something lurking that you can't quite shake off. But people were in a hurry. As always, I remember hearing someone laugh, muttering something about the stench, some stranger offering a joke to try to lighten the tension in the packed space. We were all pressed shoulder to shoulder, jostling in the narrow hallways leading to the train platforms. A little bit of water was nothing in the grand scheme of things, nothing to make anyone turn back, anyway, and then the train rolled in. I saw it. I was right there when the doors opened, standing so close to the tracks that I could feel the rush of air as the train screeched to a stop. I don't know if you were there, but I was. I can still see it in my mind, clear as day. When the train pulled up, something felt wrong. It was subtle at first, like a background hum, but it had an edge to it. Some people in the crowd began to back away, clutching their noses or fanning at the air, wincing at that pungent odor that clung to everything. But the doors slid open anyway, and without thinking twice, people flooded inside. It's the nature of a crowded station. Everyone is anxious to get on board, desperate to beat the rush, to find a spot where they won't be crushed. Even with the water, even with the smell, people were still cramming into the cars, wedging themselves against the doors, shoulder to shoulder. Once the doors slid shut, there was no way out. They thought they were escaping the mess on the platform, the dripping pipes and muddy water pooling underfoot. But it was already with them. I don't know how to describe it any other way. It was like a pulse in the air, a presence you couldn't see but that you could feel. A thrum in the walls, an echo of something alive and aware. We hadn't realized yet, but by the time the last passenger had stepped aboard, it had already seeped in. It was spreading. Invisible, winding through the train like smoke on a breeze, creeping in through every crack and crevice, wrapping itself around each passenger, seeping into every breath. It was as if the air had thickened, like breathing it in meant something was slipping inside, something alive and dark, something that knew us, knew each of us intimately, our weaknesses, our fears. The lights flickered as the train pulled out of the station, humming along the tracks. It started as a low murmur, almost a vibration, growing louder as they moved deeper into the tunnel. I wasn't on board, thank God, but I was there, on the platform, watching as the train disappeared, carrying everyone within it into the darkness. And even after it was gone, the strange sensation lingered, that feeling that something was still there with us, just below the surface. I could only imagine what those people were feeling as they sped into the tunnel. For a few seconds, I think they probably felt relieved, thinking they'd finally escaped the water and the smell. But the darkness closed in quickly, heavy and suffocating. In the cars, the air grew thick, humid with that rancid stench, so strong now that it clung to the back of their throats, coating their lungs. They would have tried to ignore it at first, packed in as tightly as they were, avoiding each other's eyes, glancing down at their feet. It was just another train ride until the screaming started. I couldn't hear it from the platform, not really, but I felt it. Somewhere in the depths of those dark tunnels, something had taken root, something that didn't belong. It was patient, methodical, spreading slowly but surely. I imagine it began with one or two people feeling strange, like something was crawling beneath their skin. They might have shifted uncomfortably, clutching at their arms or rubbing their hands together as if to shake off the feeling. But then it grew worse. They couldn't just shake it off anymore. It clawed its way up, scratching from the inside, like jagged edges twisting their veins, binding their muscles in knots. Their bodies began to betray them, one by one. They started changing. I wasn't there, but I heard the stories afterward, whispered in hushed voices, passed around in shivering gasps. They say that limbs began to contort, bending in impossible angles, bones breaking, reshaping. Hands stretched, skin tearing and reforming, knitting together into grotesque shapes. You couldn't even recognize them as human anymore. Whatever it was breaking them, turning them inside out, merging flesh with flesh, twisting bone with bone. They were changing, each one into a reflection of their worst fears, and then they screamed. Their cries echoed through the tunnel, bouncing off the cold stone walls, filling every inch of that enclosed space with the sound of pure, unfiltered terror. People pounded on the doors, trying to pry them open, clawing at the windows, begging to be let out, but there was no escape. The train kept moving, a closed cough and speeding through the dark, carrying with it a terrible, pulsing life that was consuming them, one by one. The last train had closed its doors, and it had no intention of letting them go. It was almost like whatever was there had a purpose, like it wanted them to know fear before it took them, wanted them to feel every moment of pain and helplessness. And slowly, it began to merge them together. That's what people don't understand when they hear about the last train, why it's so important to stay away. It wasn't just that they were taken, it's that they were turned into something new, something hideous and alive. Now, they're still down there, moving as one, joined in a single, writhing mass of flesh. There's no other way to describe it. They're not people anymore. They're something else, a single being made up of hundreds, all fused together, each one still alive, but locked in a state of eternal agony. They roam the tunnels, hidden in the darkness, slithering and shifting through the old, abandoned tracks, always just out of sight. And if you stand still long enough in the right part of the city, sometimes you can feel it. You can feel the vibrations underfoot, hear the faint, distant echo of their screams. People have tried to forget. Everyone's heard the story, but no one talks about it. They pretend it never happened, that it's just an urban legend, a ghost story to tell around a fire. But I was there. I saw it with my own eyes. I know the truth. That train is still down there, somewhere, carrying its cargo of twisted souls through the endless darkness. And the worst part, it's growing. The floodwaters were only the beginning. Whatever was in them, it's still spreading, seeping into the ground, reaching for the surface. Sometimes, when it rains heavily, the water levels rise, and people hear strange noises echoing through the drains, voices that don't belong. Some people swear they've seen shapes in the water, twisted faces, clawed hands reaching up from the depths, trying to drag them down. It's only a matter of time before it reaches the surface. One day, it'll break through, spreading through the sewers, the pipes, the drains, crawling into every dark corner of the city. And when that day comes, no one will be safe. There are only a few things that make my days feel normal: work, the gym, and a long, hot shower to wash it all away before collapsing in front of the TV. After work, I always head to the gym to run my 2 miles. That little ritual that helps me feel like I've done something good for myself before I fall back into the regular grind. The locker rooms there, though, total nightmare. They're always filled with old men who are a little too comfortable with the whole public nudity concept, treating it like their private spa. Honestly, I'm convinced they do it on purpose, standing around stark naked, casually blow-drying places no one should be blow-drying. So, I skip the lockers altogether. Instead, I toss my gym bag under the coat rack, where everyone else's bags are thrown into a tangled mess of nylon and zippers. It's not like I have much in there anyway, just my work clothes and a granola bar. Nothing worth locking up. That day, everything started the same as always. I ran my 2 miles, felt the burn in my legs, then grabbed my bag, threw it over my shoulder, and headed home. No big deal. It was just one of those days where you're mindlessly going through the motions. That's how I describe it, mindless. But as soon as I got home, things started to feel off. I tossed my gym bag onto the table, and the sound it made, well, it wasn't right. Instead of the usual soft thud, it landed with a metallic clang. I stopped, staring at it, my heart beating a little faster. It didn't make sense. I hadn't put anything heavy in there, let alone anything metal. A weird feeling crept up my spine as I unzipped the bag, trying to brush it off as a silly mix-up, maybe a forgotten water bottle or something I'd left in there by accident. But as soon as I opened it, I realized the bag wasn't mine. The compartments were different, subtly off, and there was this faint smell like oil, mixed with something faintly metallic. A twinge of embarrassment hit me. I must have grabbed someone else's bag by mistake. Great. I pictured some sweaty guy at the gym realizing his bag was missing and cursing me out. I dug through the bag to see if there was an ID or something I could use to find the owner. It didn't feel right going through a stranger's stuff, but I figured I'd get it back to him. No harm done. But as I pulled out a red sweatshirt and set it aside, my fingers brushed against cold metal. I froze, my hand hovering over the item. I didn't want to pull it out, I don't know why. I just didn't, but the logical part of my brain urged me on. So I lifted the sweatshirt fully to see what was underneath. It was a handgun. I slowly pulled it out, dreading what I'd find. As soon as I saw it, I wished I hadn't. The picture was of me. It was taken from across a grocery store aisle. The camera clearly focused on me as I pushed a cart, oblivious to the fact that someone was watching. My stomach churned, bile rising in my throat as I forced myself to look through the rest of the photos. Each one made my skin crawl more than the last. Another photo showed me through the window of my classroom. I teach high school English, and that shot must have been taken after hours, while I was grading papers at my desk. The worst photo, though, was one I recognized instantly. It was my senior portrait, the same one I'd had printed in my high school yearbook. Someone had cut it out, leaving jagged edges where the scissors had slipped. This wasn't just some random gym bag. Whoever this bag belonged to had been watching me, following me. I stumbled back, dropping the photos on the table, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911, barely able to focus as my mind spun with horror and confusion. Just as the call connected, I heard a noise outside, a car door slamming. I glanced out the window, and my blood ran cold. A dark car I didn't recognize was parked in my driveway. The engine was still running. And then, in slow motion, I saw the driver's side door open. A tall figure stepped out, looking up at my house, his gaze hard and fixed, like he knew exactly where I was. I scrambled for the lock on the back door, my fingers slipping as panic seized me. I twisted the deadbolt into place, adrenaline flooding my veins. But then I heard another sound, a soft click, and I realized that the front door, the one I never bothered to lock in my quiet neighborhood, was wide open. The figure was inside my house. I heard slow, deliberate footsteps moving through the front hall. I held my breath, crouched low behind the kitchen island, praying he wouldn't come in here, that he'd look around, see no one, and just leave. I squeezed my eyes shut, wishing I could make myself disappear. The footsteps grew closer, slow and methodical, like he was taking his time, searching each room one by one. I forced myself to open my eyes, my gaze darting around the kitchen. There was a knife block just a few feet away, and I reached for it, my hand trembling as I pulled out the biggest one I could find. Then I heard it, a low, grating voice, rough and unsteady. He was muttering to himself, something I couldn't quite make out, and then he chuckled, a dark, unsettling sound that made my blood freeze. It was like he was enjoying this, savoring the chase. I tightened my grip on the knife, bracing myself. If he came into the kitchen, I'd have to fight. I didn't know if I could do it, but I knew I'd have no other choice. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, my pulse so loud I thought it might give me away. Then, out of nowhere, I heard him speak, his voice soft but clear, dripping with menace. "I know you're here." My stomach dropped, and I bit down on my lip, fighting the urge to scream. He moved closer, his footsteps heavy against the tile floor. I tightened my grip on the knife, every muscle in my body tensed, waiting. But then, just as he was about to step into the kitchen, a loud siren blared from the driveway. Red and blue lights flashed through the window, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I heard a curse, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps retreating. The door slammed shut, and the engine outside revved, tires squealing as the car tore out of my driveway. I stayed frozen in place, still clutching the knife, too stunned to move as the police burst through the front door, their voices filling the silence as they called out, asking if anyone was inside. It took me a moment to gather myself, to drop the knife and stand up on shaking legs. I stumbled into the hall, my heart still racing. My mind a blur as I tried to explain what had happened. The officers listened, nodding grimly, their expressions dark as they looked over the bag, the photos, the gun. They told me they'd look for him, that they'd patrol the area and watch my house. But as they spoke, I could see it in their eyes, the look that said they couldn't promise anything, that they couldn't guarantee I'd be safe. For the next few days, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man's face, heard his voice, felt the weight of his presence in my home. I stopped going to the gym, stopped leaving the house unless it was absolutely necessary. I changed my locks, installed cameras, even bought a new phone. But even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to come back. And the worst part, every time I hear a car door slam, every time I see someone lingering just a little too long outside, my heart stops. Because I know that he's out there, and one day, he'll come back. The only question is when. I can still remember it like it was yesterday. It was the fall of 2010, and Slender Man was all anyone could talk about. My friends and I were absolutely obsessed reading creepy stories, watching those grainy videos that gave everyone chills. We'd even made our own game based on Slender Man, where one person would dress up as him and hide in the woods. The rest of us would have to walk through the trees in the dark, trying to avoid eye contact with the Slender Man, or we'd be dead and have to stop in place until someone rescued us. It was terrifying, but that was the thrill. This particular night, we were having a sleepover at my friend Jake's house. He had this big backyard that stretched into the woods, and it was the perfect spot for our game. There were 5 of us, me, Jake, Luke, Ben, and Nick. We were all around 14 or 15 and had just enough rebellious spirit to want to scare ourselves half to death. After watching a few horror movies and psyching ourselves up, we decided to play. Luke volunteered to be Slender Man this time, so he grabbed an old white sheet and wrapped it around his face and body. He slipped into the woods to find a hiding spot while the rest of us counted to 100 by the back fence, the quiet night making everything seem extra eerie. As soon as we hit 100, we all spread out and began to sneak through the trees. The only rule was to avoid eye contact with Luke, which in the pitch black woods was a lot harder than it sounds. Every time a branch cracked underfoot or an owl hooted, I felt a jolt of adrenaline. It was exhilarating, trying to get to the other side of the woods without dying. We were all whispering to each other, trying to stay quiet, but too freaked out to keep silent. The moon was our only source of light, casting long shadows that made every tree look like it was hiding something, or someone. I don't remember much about the game itself, just the constant sense of dread that made each step a little harder to take. I think at one point, Ben even jumped when a squirrel ran across his path, which sent the rest of us into a fit of nervous giggles that we tried to stifle. But eventually, one by one, we all managed to make it out of the woods without dying, and we started celebrating our victory on the other side, laughing and catching our breath. Luke, still in his makeshift slender costume, walked out of the trees to join us, pulling the sheet off his face and grinning like a madman. We were all pumped, high on the thrill of the game, joking about who had been the most scared and who was the best at sneaking. But then someone noticed that our other 2 friends, Ben and Nick, were missing. At first, we thought they were just trying to mess with us. Maybe they were hiding somewhere, waiting to jump out and give us one last scare. We laughed and started calling out for them, joking that we weren't scared anymore, that the game was over, and they should come out. But the woods stayed silent. As the minutes ticked by, our laughs grew quieter. Then Jake's dad came outside, drawn by our yelling. He frowned, asking what was going on, and we quickly explained that Ben and Nick had gone missing in the woods during our game. At first, he didn't seem worried, just annoyed that we were making so much noise. But, as we told him how long we'd been looking, his expression changed. He told us to stay by the house while he went in to search, probably thinking they'd wandered off a little too far or gotten lost in the dark. The minutes dragged on as he searched. The flashlight beam from Jake's dad's flashlight kept flickering between the trees, and with every new shadow, I felt my chest tighten a little more. We were whispering nervously to each other now, our imaginations running wild. I couldn't help but wonder, what if something had actually happened? What if Slender Man wasn't just a game? It sounds stupid now, but in that moment, in the dark, it felt terrifyingly possible. I was sure I'd seen something moving in the trees, lurking just out of sight, and I couldn't shake this creeping feeling that we weren't alone. An hour had passed, the fear settled in our bones. We hadn't had cell phones back then, not really, just 1 or 2 old flip phones that we used in emergencies, but none of us had brought one outside. I remember whispering to Jake, feeling my voice shake, asking if maybe we should just go back inside and get help. Finally, Jake's dad came back, looking serious. He said he hadn't found them and told us he was going to call the police. I felt my heart sink as he pulled out his phone and dialed, explaining the situation to the operator. The waiting was unbearable. We huddled together by the porch, our eyes fixed on the dark woods, each of us jumping at every small sound. In that moment, I was convinced that something supernatural was at play. I know it sounds silly, but at that age, with our obsession with Slender Man, it felt real. The woods were quiet and dark, and the thought of my friends just vanishing seemed so wrong. I felt this horrible sense of helplessness, like there was something in the shadows we couldn't fight, something that had taken my friends, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. Just as the police were pulling up to the house, with their lights flashing in the driveway, we heard a loud crackling of leaves and twigs behind us. We whipped around to see Ben and Nick stumbling out of the woods, laughing their heads off. The mix of relief, anger, and sheer horror that hit me in that moment is something I'll never forget. I wanted to hug them and punch them at the same time. As they got closer, we saw the huge grins on their faces as they realized they'd scared us half to death. They were out of breath from laughing so hard, completely oblivious to the fact that we'd thought they were gone for good. Apparently, they'd snuck over to the adjacent golf course and had been hiding there the entire time, watching us freak out. Jake's dad was furious, and so were the cops who had arrived and were just getting out of their patrol car. We tried to explain that it had all been part of a game gone wrong, but it just came out sounding stupid. The officers didn't say much, just gave us a hard look and told Jake's dad to keep a closer eye on us. I was so mad at Ben and Nick that night, but looking back, it's become one of those legends we always tell around Halloween. We still laugh about it every time we get together, even if the story's softened over the years. I'll never forget that feeling, though, that sense of true, raw terror that only comes from thinking the worst has happened. In hindsight, maybe we all needed that scare, a taste of what real fear feels like. Because after that, Slender Man wasn't nearly as scary as the reality of losing someone, even if it was just a prank. That night became a memory that binds us together, a story we'll tell our kids someday when they're old enough to understand.